Welcome to the Divorce Coalition live show, where we share knowledge in our fight against domestic abuse and coercive control in all forms. I'm your host, Beverly Price. I represent a group of top podcast hosts and divorce and domestic violence professionals who have united to carry the message of the fight against domestic abuse. Our mission is to bring understanding, healing, and resilience to the forefront, ending the cycle of abuse one survivor at a time. With expert guests, practical advice, and enlightening conversations, you'll find that knowledge is power. Whether you're a victim, survivor, professional, or observer, you'll find something here that will help and spark more thinking. So without further ado, let's get started. Today, my guest is Dr. Marie Cocchiola. Christine is a magnificent person. She is a top expert in coercive control, which we're going to talk about today. She's a member of the International Association and founding member of several organizations on coercive control. Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have to say, you're magnificent for starting this divorce coalition and for getting so many people on board in one place. It's just so important. I always say this field can be very siloed. And if we continue to remain siloed, we're not sharing all of the important information as much as we should. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. I believe that when we come together, we can achieve so much more than the sum of our parts. And so that's one exciting thing about watching the coalition. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself? Because I certainly didn't tell them the full story.
Sure. So I began this work when I was 19, and I became an advocate for domestic abuse and child abuse and sexual assault. And then I've worked in child welfare. I've been an educator, and I became a social worker, worked and have been teaching. I'm actually in my college office right now, teaching social work and domestic abuse for the last 20 some odd years, but also teaching on trauma for over 30 some odd years.
Wow.
And I'm one of those people who was teaching on it all of the time and didn't even actually recognize it was happening in my own home. And I think that's a really important message for people, is that even the most astute of us can miss the signs. And, so I really feel like, for me, when I think about the vernacular of what we're talking about today, coercive control is the underpinnings of all abuse. It is. Coercive control is really the concept that others will want to exert power and control over us, whether it's individuals in a home where we sleep at night, or if it's in groups, whether it's where we work and we have a boss who maybe is exerting power and control over us, or whether it's, in bigger agencies and the government. We can talk about Roe v. Wade being turned over. Is that an example of coercion and control occurring, that women now have rights violated?
Interesting.
So I see it as the underpinnings of virtually all abuse. It's child sex trafficking. It's sexual abuse. The grooming stages of relationships. Abusers do not show up in relationships and say, "Oh, I'm going to abuse you." They show up. There's no sign that says I'm an abuser. They show up in a way that makes us think that they're decent human beings. But the insidious, nuanced nature of this abuse is that we don't even know it's happening until, as Dr. Evan Stark states, really the person who propelled the term, who was on my doctoral committee. I was blessed to have him on my doctoral committee. He said it's like carpenter ants devouring the foundation of a home. You don't even know it's happening until it's too late. And if the abuse were physical, we'd all know it was happening. Right. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't become physical. Physical abuse is the further exertion of coercive control.
Right. And I think an interesting thought in that is that when you think about physical abuse and you think about the court system, it's still challenging to prove, and it's still challenging to have people believe it. And you then take it a step further with coercive control. How do you prove it? How do you, I know there's, what did we say, 6 states that now have either legislation in place or potential legislation in place. So if you go to court, what do you do to show it and demonstrate it?
Yeah, so I think again, so it's great that now New Jersey, we're so excited, has passed the House and the Senate, and we're
Mm-hmm.
waiting for the governor to sign codifying coercive control. But the reality is that in the other 44 states, you have to have physical evidence. And
Right.
so, and you know, I always say if this abuse was happening by a stranger, if there was a stranger sending you 3,000 harassing, threatening emails, then there would be a response by the legal system, right?
Right.
But because it's your ex or your partner, there isn't a response. And that's quite disheartening, because then it leaves victims and survivors feeling like they are trapped. So, you know, in those 6 states, the good news is that if somebody has used ways to intimidate you, to isolate you, if you can prove that you've been manipulated in some way, you know, that they have financially kept you in a space of, you know, not being able to earn your own money, or that you're the only one earning money, I would say that it's going to be, these are things that are not easy to discern to the less educated person, right? And so that's part of the problem we're seeing, as you know, in our family court system, is that the family court doesn't acknowledge non-physical abuse. And even if there is physical abuse, they oftentimes are minimizing it, and then
Yes.
saying children should still have shared parenting with an abuser. And
Mm-hmm.
they're not recognizing the harmful, as you know, my area, my specialization is the harmful impact on children. And that
Mm-hmm.
when I'm growing up in a home like this, the trauma is very significant.
Absolutely.
I was on a call yesterday or the day before with a young woman who said that she never knew what her experiences were until she was about 25. And then all of a sudden she started to suffer from, you know, migraines, and, you know, had so much like inability to sleep well, and had an autoimmune diagnosis.
Oh,
And
wow.
when we look at the history, and then she said, I started to hear this word narcissistic abuse. And then now she sees it all as, you know, I mean, we can call them narcissistic abusers, but they're really coercively controlling people, right? And so
Exactly.
I always like to use coercive controller, because that's their behavior. And so this young woman was like, I don't know what's wrong with me. And I said, honey, you lived in a home your entire life, regulating your behavior around what you thought would either keep your protective parents safe or keep equilibrium in the home. That's a hypervigilance that is
Yeah.
so
A lot
harmful
of
to the
pressure on a child.
a lot. It's a hypervigilance in the brain, and it really does impact brain development. And so um yeah, so just so what we need is we need education to ensure that court professionals are open to learning what this can look like and how it can show up in court. But I think the issue that we're having is that we know that a lot of court professionals believe they have enough knowledge. That there is, you know, there's the Saunders study, there's the Bala study that show that judges and court professionals really don't believe women when they disbelieve women when they share
Right.
their bad news. So
Right. And that's terribly sad. And there are, I think, a few women that do manufacture that statement of abuse, but the statistics on abuse are so huge. You know, the 1 out of 3, and maybe it's even higher than that. That how can you deny it? Is so true. Now, you talk a little bit about the impact on children and women of coercive control. If someone has realized and experienced coercive control, what can they do to recover to what options do they have?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, a trauma-trained therapist who understands coercive control. I think one of the things, as a licensed clinical social worker, one of the things that I'm very passionate about is this idea that we need more trained clinicians, because oftentimes when a client presents themselves as anxious or wishing that their relationship was healthier, like that they were happier in their relationship, oftentimes what we do is we try to fix what the client is reporting. We try to fix what the client is reporting versus actually fixing, like determining what the foundational issues are in that relationship. So if a client comes in and let's say they're 15, they're not even someone who's married, they're 15, but they're anxious and depressed. What's going on in that family? That's a social work perspective, by the way, which is why I love social work, because social workers look in the human environment. What's going on in your family system that might be causing or contributing
Right.
to this anxiety? And so, if I'm an adult, and I come in and I have a husband, what's going on in my relationship dynamics, good or bad, that might be contributing, right? And so how do I support my client to have agency, to gain clarity? And it's really about sharing with them, what are healthy boundaries? How do we know if a relationship is healthy? What's the trauma bond? And so I was gaslit by therapists who continued to tell me that, well, you have some anxiety, or maybe it's because of this or because of that. And then the therapist who was willing to work with my ex while my ex was literally coercively controlling me in therapy. So that's a problem. It's an endemic problem. Going back to your, statement about how there's so many women who have experienced this, I always like to caution listeners that sometimes we have statistics for men that seem startling. Right. And I think it's really important to contextualize that the problem is that oftentimes men who are harmed, they're harmed by other men. This happens in non-heteronormative relationships at a higher rate. And that, unfortunately, if I am in a relationship with a coercive controller, and let's just say I'm in the laundry room and there's an argument going on, and I try to get out of that laundry room and I push the coercive controller because I've been in there for 20 minutes and I'm flooded and I just want to get out of that laundry room. So I push that person, and that person decides at that moment to call the police. Who's the victim?
Right.
He is, because I pushed him, when actually I was trapped. And so we really have to be very cautious when we look at the statistics and discern who has not only the ability to have, because of patriarchal norms, by the way, the ability to exert more power and control, who typically has more money, who typically is going to be more believed by systems.
Right.
Kate Mann talks about this thing called empathy. We have really, we do in general give more leeway to men who behave in a way that is not appropriate. We have empathy for them versus sympathy. And so if a woman does one wrong thing, she's held to account. If a man does 5 wrong things, he may not be held to the same account. And so really knowing that perpetrators will often flip the narrative on victims and claim victim. And they do it a lot. And our system uses those statistics. Those are the statistics. Versus if I was trapping, let's say, a partner in the laundry room, well, would that partner actually, like, in other words, I might push my partner, but that partner has so much more ability due to physical strength that for me to push literally means, like, is not as impactful. It's more about entrapment is the point.
Right. And I think another part of that is the person who has charisma and can speak and be believed and put on that front can be believed more often by, let's say, police that are called to the site to deal with that. They can talk themselves out of it more easily.
Well, absolutely. If we think about the characterological, I call them the characterological traits of abusers, they learned from a very, very young age that they could not be themselves. They were not loved unconditionally. They couldn't be authentically themselves. So they learned at a very young age to hide who they truly were. They're the best actors.
Interesting.
They get an Academy Award. They're the best actors on the planet. And
Hmm.
that's why we're always so surprised when we hear this famous person has done this really egregious thing, Jeffrey
Hmm.
Epstein, right? Like Bill Cosby, because
Hmm.
they had learned to cover up who they are so fantastically that, yes, when the police show up, they've got this really great, like they're in theater mode. They're in theater mode.
Right.
And that comes so naturally to them versus victims and survivors are so authentically themselves to the point that they share vulnerabilities with harmful people, and
Right.
those harmful people weaponize those vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
It's perfect. I call it, as you know, I have a podcast, Beverly, called Perfect Prey, because
Hmm.
I did a research study and it affirmed what I knew already in my heart, is that victims and survivors suffer at a very great rate subjugation, which is what in the clinical world we call a maladaptive coping mechanism. It's a desire to accommodate others, to
Right.
ensure that everybody is
To
okay,
please.
that we're
Yeah.
we're we're fixers, we're highly empathic, and we're loyal to a fault, we're forgiving to a fault, and the the perpetrators, these people who are born in this way, know they seek out people like us. We are
Yeah.
their perfect prey.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about that victim. Is there a profile or their characteristics? How do you go about identifying a victim, or how does a
Emotional abuse assessment. I mean, he's not talking about it in the lens of coercive control. There are now some coercive control assessments out there, but a really simple one is the basis of my clinical work comes from schema therapy, and Jeffrey Young and Janet Glasgow created a subjugation assessment. It's 10 questions, and it really just talks about what are these character traits about you. And I think it's a very important conversation about how, if we can figure out that we maybe suffer from this, um, it, for lack of a better word, I think it would probably be that we don't have as much agency in our life as we should have. And again, it's not a bad thing, but it is if somebody takes advantage of it, right? So, really important that we advocate for ourselves. But in that, when our children see us subjugated, when they see us over and over again, overly accommodating, walking on
right?
eggshells, not standing up for ourselves in a position of personal power, our children learn either to be like us, or they learn that a good coping mechanism is to be more like the abuser. Now, there's obviously a gray area in there. It's not black and white, but our goal is to teach our children that we have agency, that
Hmm.
that they should have agency, that they should have critical thinking and discern what's happening in the family system so that they don't acquire some more unhealthy coping mechanisms. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have an example. I had been married a number of times and have experienced coercive control and abuse in several marriages. And I was married, and I was in an argument with this coercive controller. And my daughter came into the room and said, "You don't deserve her." And so then my daughter and I were in therapy. And I told the therapist, I said, "I'm trying to teach my daughter that I'll stick with a marriage and stay because I have been married before." And the therapist turned to me and said, "That's not what you're teaching her at all. You're teaching her that if you allow yourself to be treated like this and aren't worthy of better treatment, that then she is not worthy of better treatment." And
Mhm.
I went home that night and ended that marriage. But it was so shocking to me that I hadn't even considered that.
It's so important, right? They're watching us,
Mhm.
and then, to add to that, like how you're, and not that you need to share this, but like what happens when we do leave that abuser? Has that abuser begun already? I always say they start day one indoctrinating our children against us. So if
Right.
we leave, sometimes there's the worry, what's going to happen with my relationship with my child, right? And this is why a lot of victims stay, is they're worried that, are they going to, is it better to, I was just on a call right before our call today with a mom who was like, do I stay and know that it's awful to stay and my children are witnessing this? Or do I leave and worry that maybe I only have one child come with me? And so, oh my
Right.
gosh, that is no choice. That's entrapment.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, One of the concerns I have heard about jumping back to the court system is that when you use the tools of the court system, such as protective orders and motions and so forth, that there seem to be no consequences for abusers. They can violate one after the other, but it's kind of like they're discounted because nothing ever happens. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. I actually was just writing an article about this, that talks about this vexatious litigation, right? And so the idea that the court system becomes another weapon of the coercive controller.
Right.
And then, so sadly, sometimes it means walking away from some things, because if we remain engaged in the court system, you're either going to lose money to attorneys, right? Or that coercive controller. So we have to think about, again, this pathology of the coercive controller is they love to see us struggle. They want to see us working hard for maybe fairness. Maybe it's fair that you get X amount of child support every month. Absolutely. But if the coercive controller thinks that you're really upset about giving that up, will they let go? And so we have to strategize, what will this coercive controller, and some of them won't give up anything, but what will they give up? I always say, like, let's just say they might be going for custody simply because these people are really obsessed with money. They
Mhm.
like to use money to hurt people, and the court system becomes the perfect place to exert that control, right?
Right.
So what can you let go of? If there's any way to have the most important thing for your children is for them to have more time with you.
Mhm.
More time. I don't care what time that is. I hear from moms who are like, he never comes and picks them up when he's supposed to, and then I have to drive them over. And I'm like, if he doesn't come, don't bring them. Like, like like, in other words, if he's supposed to pick your child up at 3 o'clock from school and he didn't show up, and you want to help hold him accountable for not showing up, I wouldn't hold.
I think we've had a little bit of technical trouble with Dr. Cocciola. One of the things we've been talking about is coercive control. And I think that there are a number of factors to consider. It's how do you determine that you are with a coercive controller? How do you determine what is within you that makes you a victim of coercive control? And what makes you vulnerable to it? Dr. Cocciola is back. Um, so I was just kind of restating a few things. Um, and I think you've talked about it a little bit, but what is it about a coercive controller that makes them so dead set on harming others? We still have a little bit of technical trouble. Are you there, Christine? Okay. All right, let's keep going then. One of the exciting pieces of news that was released today is that New Jersey has just sent legislation to the governor to approve coercive control as a form of abuse, which is so exciting because, as we talked about up until this point, we're really only talking about physical abuse. Now, when we look at coercive control, as what Christine said, think about all the different kinds of situations where that abuser is trying to exert power and control. Obviously, there's physical abuse, there's emotional abuse, there's mental abuse, there's financial abuse, there's legal abuse, there is elder abuse, there is child abuse, and so much more that is involved with coercive control. Christine, can you hear me now? Okay, perfect. So, a question for you is, what about these coercive controllers make them so dead set on harming others?
Sure, sure. And that kind of, I think it probably, if I can maybe finish up what I was saying before, I think it's a
Sure.
perfect segue. So I think the idea is that we have to be willing to let go of the rope a little bit, because they need to think they won.
Right.
And so how do we make them believe they devastated us? But actually, we won. So maybe they believe they took away our house, and that certainly happened to me. Or maybe they believe that they got 60% of the time, and we only got 40% of the time with the kids. And in our heads, we're so grateful they didn't get 70%. We
Right.
have to actually make them believe that they won, and that we are not, we are really upset about it, but that actually secretly we're so grateful for what we have.
Interesting.
Which is really, really hard when you've lost everything, by the way. Let me be really
Right.
clear. That is a really, really hard pill to swallow.
Right.
But when they think they've won is when they're more likely to let go. And so if we remain engaged in the court system, and every single attorney is going to tell you, oh, just, you deserve this, you deserve that. If we remain in the court system, then that is just going to be weaponized over and over again. And so I think it's what makes them behave this way. We know is that if I am a child who has been so harmed that I cannot be who I truly am, I'm not allowed to be authentic in my life, I'm shamed over and over again. You're not good enough. You're so dumb. You should do this sport, not that sport. And that continues to happen in the home. And what I just said probably resonates for protective parents who have heard the coercive controller say that to their own children.
Exactly.
That coercive controller is trying to imprint that shame on your child. And that's what happened to them. And what do we know? We know that if I have been shamed in that way, one of my coping mechanisms is to exert control over all aspects of my life to ensure I don't feel vulnerable. And so that's what makes them do that. And so we know, I say that coercive controllers will do anything to harm the victim, and they will use the systems to further exert control. And so I think, to your point, research affirms they are drawn towards conflict. They love conflict. We have to disengage from the conflict without them thinking that we won. We have to disengage with them believing that they won. That's the strategy.
Absolutely. So that leads into my next question. If you decide to divorce the coercive controller, does that coercive control end with that divorce?
Absolutely not. So upwards of 95% of victims and survivors suffer a further exertion of coercive control post-separation. It's called post-separation abuse. But it's when he has lost control, he's going to exert, I'm saying it could be a she, but again, women are not capable of the same level of exertion. It doesn't mean women can't be narcissistically abusive. It doesn't mean that women can't be coercive controllers. But what it does mean is they don't have the same ability due to societal norms to exert the same exertion of the pain.
Gotcha.
So, but in that, yes, there is always, very rarely do coercive controllers just move on with their life. Now,
Right.
if they do, then they probably have other aspects of their life that they can begin to exert control over.
Like a new girlfriend.
Yes.
Absolutely. Wow.
Yes.
Wow. Um, so what can a person do if they find themselves in a relationship with a coercive controller?
So I think it's so important that you know you are not alone, that this can happen to anyone. I mean, anyone can become a victim, and that you find a network of people that get it. Because and I know, Beverly, you will totally understand what I'm going to say, is that this is a disenfranchised grief. When this happens to us, people who have not experienced it don't truly get it. They don't understand the insidious, nuanced nature.
Right.
The father will say that shows up and is the coach on the baseball team, and everybody loves this person because they're the world's best charlatans,
Mm-hmm.
and like I said, get an Academy Award. And so the idea that people will minimize your experiences, they'll say, oh, it's not that bad, or he's a good father. These people are not good parents. The children are objectified from day one. Their only purpose is to fulfill whatever that coercive controller needs. And so it might be, that they love baseball, and then their child loves baseball and they seem like a great coach, but that is only because it's fulfilling a need for them. It's not
Right.
unconditional. And so I want victims to know they're not alone. I want victims to know they're not crazy, that you are being gaslit all of the time, and you have not really been feeling your intuition for the longest time. Ask yourself, is there something in this relationship that is harmful? Am I being made fun of? Am I being diminished? Are my children engaging in this making fun mockery of me? How do I begin to gain clarity? And then look at I call it a path to freedom. What is your path to freedom? How are you may not be able to get out now. You may not feel like you want to leave now, and that's okay. There's no judgment for staying at all, because sometimes staying feels safer.
Right.
But what is your path? How are you going to take care of yourself and leave? When you escape, it's escape. When will you escape and how? Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, Christine, I want to thank you so much for being with me today. This has been so enlightening. One last question is how do we educate people about coercive control? How can we change the perception? How can we get people who think he didn't hit me is the theme? And what can we do?
Sure. So I mean, education is my platform. I am a clinician, but I'm a college educator, and I have created programming specifically for this. So I have a master class that's 2.5 hours long for attorneys, any attorneys listening who want to take a course for their whole, office, their firm. I It also can count as an ethical, it's called ethics, or CLE for ethics. I also have a clinician training I've recently created, because therapists need to understand what's going on in all aspects, through the family court, through what's happening in the family, the psychological trauma to the children. We need more coercive control informed clinicians. And I think that's so important. And as you know, I have a protective parenting program. I believe the
Mhm.
best people to support their children are the protective parents. Listen, a child goes to therapy, if they're engaged in therapy, for 50 minutes a week. if that therapist doesn't understand what's really going on in the family system, a therapist could inadvertently gaslight a child.
Exactly.
Who's the best person to help this child navigate this very toxic, harmful relationship? It's the protective parent who actually gets it. And my protective parenting program is specific to teaching protective parents the tools and strategies they need to support their children.
Wow.
So I think education, we just need to keep on elevating the conversation. And we can't talk about it enough, in my opinion. So thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, absolutely. Well, all of Christine's information will be available in the show notes, and you can watch this episode on WGSN's YouTube channel, Divorce Coalition. Please like and subscribe so we can reach as many people as possible. And we have a special gift for you, a free ebook called Stop Condoning Domestic Violence. And you can find it at the divorcecoalition.com website under ebook. Remember, you can find more information about how to get help, help another, take action as a professional, or stop the silence allowing domestic abuse to continue. Go to divorcecoalition.com. You can also find us on Instagram at Divorce Coalition page. The more we grow, the stronger the fight against domestic abuse. Let's come together, break the silence, and champion a new future. Stay tuned every other Tuesday at 9 a.m. for another episode of Divorce Coalition Live. Until next time, stay safe and grow.